Hey, church family, welcome to our ongoing study of the book of Acts. We're in chapter 7, verse 1. Hope you can stay tuned. This is vacation edition of our study. Look forward to being with you. We're looking at a very interesting and intriguing character in the Bible. That's Stephen. Stephen's a great example. We've been introduced to him in chapter 6. He's selected, remember, with the other 6 men to serve in a ministry position. He's serving the widows who've been neglected or overlooked in the daily distribution. And so not only is he talented and willing, able to serve, but also to speak. He's a great example in his speaking and in his suffering. We'll look at that. Chapter 7 is going to contain the fourth sermon in the book of Acts. There will be several more coming. And this is the longest sermon. In fact, this is a long chapter in the book of Acts. Someone said that this chapter begins in verse 2 with the God of glory, and it ends in verse 55 with the glory of God. And toward the end of the book, in case you don't know the story of Stephen, he is going to die by the end of this chapter. He will be the first Christian martyr as far as we know. And so he gets killed for simply preaching a sermon, preaching the truth about the nature of the Son of God. And it is a masterful sermon. We won't have time to look at it all in one lesson. We'll kind of break it up over 2 or 3 different ones. But I kind of want to give a synopsis, give an overview of the approach of Stephen in this sermon. Now here's the background going to the last few verses in chapter 6. Stephen's going to be accused of blasphemy. Not only is he a servant, but also he is a teacher. There is a synagogue of the freedmen that's composed of Cyrenians and Alexandrians, those from Cilicia. I'm seeing that in chapter 6, verse 9. And it says that they dispute with Stephen. And so he doesn't back down. He doesn't kind of say, you know what, I don't mean to be offensive. And so if I've said something to hurt your feelings, I'm sorry. Let's just call it a day. Yeah, he's going to continue to advance the cause of Christ. They're not able to resist the wisdom and the spirit by which he spoke. Sometimes when you realize you're outmanned in an argument, religiously or otherwise, you kind of dig your heels in and keep going. Stephen is not going to be bullied, not going to be intimidated. And his purpose, I don't think, is merely to win an argument. He has bigger fish to fry, as we would say. He's wanting them to understand the truth and the nature of who Jesus Christ is. So they, out of their outrage against him, try to bring him to the authorities. There's some trumped up charges in a way. It says they stirred up the people in verse 12, the elders, scribes, they came upon him, they seized him, and they brought him to the council. That would have been the Sanhedrin. Caiaphas would have been the high priest serving at that time, shortly before the end of his reign there. And there are false witnesses. You know, when you have to resort to deception and dishonesty, doesn't that weaken your case? These false witnesses are saying, this man does not cease to speak blasphemous words against this holy place and the law. For we've heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place and change the customs which Moses delivered to us. Let's look at those charges kind of one by one. Number one, blasphemous words. You know what? Stephen, I guess, was in good company because Jesus himself was accused of speaking blasphemous words. And let me tell you, blasphemy is an ugly thing. There are penalties in the Old Testament for speaking true blasphemy. But not everyone who's been accused of blasphemy is really guilty of it. And so when they said Jesus was blasphemous, later when they're going to charge Paul with the same thing, it's not tantamount to being able to prove it. It's just a reflection more on their perception of the words there. Did Stephen say bad things about the law? In truth, as far as I can tell, and we can surmise, he is simply saying that law is outmoded. It's outdated. It's been nailed to the cross. He's not doubting its inspiration. He's not saying don't read it, but rather that's probably the import of his connection there to the law. Changing the customs which Moses delivered to us. Think of it this way. God had already changed those customs. It wasn't up to Stephen or anyone else. Well, and of course Jesus did. They, as a matter of fact, would have disputed that he was alive and he was behind this movement called Christianity. But it was true that Jesus had changed the customs, and boy, what a change it was. You see, it's a change for the better. It's a change from the old to the new. from law to grace, and what a wonderful blessing we have to be part of that New Testament. And so even the last one I want to think about as we get into chapter 7 here is Jesus destroying this place. They're in the temple precinct. And so in their minds, that would be the worst thing possible. And of course, that temple in Jerusalem had been destroyed before. You go back to the Babylonian captivity. And you see Jesus' words as in Matthew 24, Luke 21, Mark 13 about the impending destruction of Jerusalem. That's a historical fact rooted in AD 70. And so it's nearly 4 decades from this point until that happens, but it does happen. And so we have the benefit of historical hindsight to know that truly what Jesus said and what Stephen was echoing would happen there. All right, so you get to chapter 7, and a simple question is asked by the high priest. Are these things so? In essence, Stephen, they made some strong charges against you. Are they true or are they not true? He might have been expecting a yes or a no. And Stephen actually, instead of giving that short answer, preaches a sermon instead. When it says that he was filled with wisdom, we see God's wisdom in him not answering with a deliberate yes or no. He's going to paint a picture. He's going to help them along and then give them an opportunity to trace a kind of a common thread through Old Testament history. And that is a rejection of righteous people and the persecution of the ones who would stand up and simply say, I am God's. And so this sermon is sometimes called the story of the Bible. It is one of, incidentally, the best summaries of some of the big characters and the big events in the Bible as anywhere else you'll see in Scripture. It's not going to reference every important person, but did you know in this chapter there are 11 Old Testament characters referenced by name? There are many others kind of implied, and it covers 12 different Old Testament books. And so this is simply kind of the outline or the high points of it. It might have been indeed a long sermon. It's a little lengthier compared to some that we read anyway. And so why did Stephen not answer with a yes or no about the charges? Number one, he knows they are biased against him. They're not really wanting to arrive at truth. He probably realizes that the only end to this is not going to be his exoneration at all, but rather his persecution. Here's how he begins it in verse 2. He said, Brethren and fathers, listen. By the way, he calls them brothers and fathers, not that he's still a practicing Old Testament Jew. I think he's trying to establish common ground there. That they would share a lineage, obviously physically, and through their Jewish roots there. He says, the God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia before he dwelt in Haran, and said to him, Get out of your country from your relatives and come to a land that I will show you. Now, why does he begin with Abraham? Number one, Abraham was still renowned in that time as the father of the faithful. Stephen wisely appeals to him, number one, because I think maybe initially Abraham predated Moses in the law. He's going to appeal back to a character and to an event that was before the law of Moses. That's going to be important for him, isn't it? Abraham's a great character, a long story. We can see why he's referenced many times in our New Testament there. And so God appeared to him not in the promised land, but a long way away. He had a journey to make, and what a journey of faith it was. It says in verse 4, Then he came out of the land of the Chaldeans and dwelt in Haran, and from there, when his father was dead, he moved him. That's God. God moved him to this land in which you now dwell. God gave him no inheritance in it, not even enough to set his foot on. But even when Abraham had no child, he promised to give it to him for a possession and to his descendants after him. Let me pause there and kind of retrace this. Do you see how Stephen is making some sweeping statements about the high points of Abraham's life? He doesn't get into, at this point, Sarah's barrenness and the decades that it took. He doesn't get into Hagar and Ishmael, all those stories that we know so well. But the idea is, here's God's appointed father of the faithful. And you read about him as in Galatians chapter 3, and how that Paul later is going to tie together that as Christians, when we by faith are baptized to Christ, we're spiritual heirs of God. We share in that same faith that Abraham was blessed for, though being part of a different covenant here. And so think about God not giving him any land, any territory. That was important. He was a wanderer. You check out chapter 11 of Hebrews. He was a stranger, a pilgrim on the earth. He and the other patriarchs said that. And so I think maybe Stephen's purpose in that is far from kind of that homeland and that focus of the temple in Jerusalem being the norm. It was actually just a shortened period of time. It wasn't always that way. And God could bless people of faith even outside of that holy land where they were at this present moment. And then watch what he says in verse 6. God spoke that his descendants would dwell in a foreign land, that they would bring them into bondage and oppress them 400 years. And that brings you into the book of Exodus, doesn't it? And then he quotes in verse 7, the nation to whom they will be in bondage I will judge, said God, and after that they shall come out and serve me in this place. When you read through Exodus and you refresh yourselves with those 10 plagues and see what God did to the Pharaoh of the land, that you can't help but coming away from that being impressed with the mind of God, the sovereignty of God, the plan and the purpose of God. For 400 years he let his people exist there in slavery. Sometimes we have trouble waiting. We struggle with patience, and we want what we want, or at least what we think is right now. And we need to look at examples like that to realize God deals with time differently than we do. And it says in verse 8, then he gave him, that's Abraham, the covenant of circumcision. And so Abraham begot Isaac and circumcised him on the 8th day. And Isaac begot Jacob, and Jacob begot the 12 patriarchs. Now, Stephen's intent in this sermon is not to trace every little specific detail in the lives of these people at all. He is going to seize upon one of those sons of Jacob, and that's going to be Joseph. And I think from this point, if there's a tie that kind of unites this section, it's going to be Joseph and later Moses, and then certainly ones from Joshua to Solomon. Even some of the prophets especially are going to be mistreated by their brothers. Did persecution ever happen by the likes of the Egyptians? Of course, we've seen the bondage and all the other different ites, Philistines, and so the captivity, the Assyrian, the Babylonian. God's people were mistreated, but often it was brother to brother. It was an in-house type of mistreatment there. And so thinking about Abraham and how God blessed him in a land outside of Palestine, finally brought the people there. He's going to talk about those 12 patriarchs for a moment. In verse 9, they, becoming envious, sold Joseph into Egypt. But God was with him and delivered him out of all of his troubles and gave him favor and wisdom in the presence of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he made him governor over Egypt and all his house. Isn't that an amazing way of skipping over the years of famine and the interpretation of the dreams there? He doesn't even broach Potiphar and his wife. He doesn't get to the brothers having that big reveal moment where Joseph, who had been speaking to them in Egyptian through an interpreter, finally says, I am your brother. But he says in verse 11, when this famine, great trouble came over all the land of Egypt and Canaan, and our fathers. Notice how Stephen said that, our fathers. Stephen's a Christian now, they're not. He wants them to be, but he could still say our fathers because they had that common Hebrew or Jewish heritage there. Our fathers, what did they do? They came, found no sustenance. But when Jacob heard, I'm in verse 12 with you, he heard there was grain in Egypt, he sent out our fathers first. And the second time Joseph was made known to his brothers, Joseph's family became known to Pharaoh. I think that the purpose of Stephen right now is to say, look, at how brother treated brother. In fact, it was brothers treating a brother. Joseph, what wrong had he done? Did he deserve to be punished and thrown in prison by Potiphar, by the Pharaoh? No, didn't deserve that. Did he deserve the mistreatment that caused him to be sold into slavery in the first place? No. Not the dreams he had about the sun, moon, and stars bowing down, not the coat of many colors. None of that justified the mistreatment that he had there. And so it says in verse 14, when Joseph's son called his father Jacob and all his relatives to him, 75 people. So Jacob went down to Egypt and he died, he and our fathers. And they were carried back to Shechem, laid in the tomb that Abraham bought for a sum of money from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem. Can I make a tie-in with you there? Abraham really didn't own anything other than the burial plot. And that's an interesting story in the book of Genesis when Sarah dies. And now Jacob, carry him back and put him there. God was able to bless them without them having a permanent resting place. It's going to be years before the conquest. And so maybe in an indirect way, Stephen is at least saying, you know what, God can bless people if they're not based out of Jerusalem. He did before. It wasn't kind of dependent upon that. I think the Jews of that day had become so focused and fixated on Jerusalem and the temple, they almost looked at it as a good luck charm. As long as we're here, maybe they could think about Babylonian captivity and their release there, and almost think that God is blessing us unconditionally because we are in the right place at the right time. Stephen is throwing all of that in helter-skelter. He's saying, you know what, God is, that's not the basis of his blessing, certainly at all. I'm going to stop there for today. Next Sunday, Lord willing, and that'll be 4th of July, we'll still have a lesson on that holiday. We'll take back up. I want to encourage you to read all of chapter 7, maybe go back and read what we've looked at so far, read ahead to the end, and see, trace Stephen's purpose in this cycle of mistreatment upon God's people. Joseph endured it. Moses, God's handpicked, his anointed lawgiver, endured it, even from his own people. Prophets were killed for doing nothing other than simply saying, this is what God wants. And so it's going to be interesting that when he finally gets around to Jesus being the ultimate prophet, the same thing happened. History repeated itself. And so Stephen is about to elaborate on Jesus being the greatest in that long line of prophets and showing the danger of rejecting him when, lo and behold, these people, enraged, are going to add Stephen to the next in the list of the martyrs. And the way that Stephen dies, we'll call attention to that. The amazing faith he had, even in the face of death, is an amazing lesson, powerful testimony for us even today. Thank you for studying along. Be looking for those little nuggets, those little interesting phrases, sometimes words that maybe we've glossed over or hurriedly pass over that shed so much light. Remember, this chapter begins with the God of glory. It ends in the glory of God. And our purpose in life, like Stephen's, is to glorify that God who uniquely is glorious. God bless us to that end. Have a good rest of your day and your week.